You got to keep them up.
That's right. You got to keep them open. Absolutely. Well, thank you, Josh. I'm going to move through some material here, and then we can have a conversation. This is not the book talk that I typically give. I thought that you might be interested in some research I did for the book. It's actually chapter 4 on what the internet is doing to our brains, because that really figures very much into how news organizations can make a transition to digital in a way in which our brains are actually working differently. And I want to begin with Marshall McLuhan. How many of you have ever tried to read Marshall McLuhan? It's pretty tough going, but he does have some very interesting ideas about how we interact with the media. And I want to just start with a little clip of Marshall McLuhan from a Woody Allen movie that's just a fun thing to watch. So why don't we take a look at that? That's not it. Technology is letting me down almost immediately here.
We saw the Fellini film last Tuesday. It was not one of his best. Like the cohesive structure.
Can we turn this up?
Sure what he wants to say. Because I've always felt it was essentially a technical film.
Right, I never do.
Granted, let's
It won't, with HTML it won't work.
Great in its use of negative imagery more than anything else. But that simple cohesive core, the feeling through an artist's work, even from one to the other.
Screaming his opinions in my ear.
You know what I'm talking about? Like all that Juliet of the Spirits or Satirica.
I think it's okay.
Incredibly indulgent. He
Oh,
really
there
is.
we
He's
go.
one of the most indulgent filmmakers. He really is.
Keyword here
And
is
without getting, let's put it
What are you depressed
without
about?
sublimation.
I missed my therapy. I overslept.
How can you possibly oversleep?
The alarm clock.
Do you know the hostile gesture that is to me?
I know, because of our sexual problem, right?
Everybody online at the New Yorker has to know our rate of intercourse.
It's like Samuel Beckett. I admire the technique, but it doesn't hit me on a gut level.
I'd like to
And
hit this
without
guy on a
doing
gut
that-
level.
Stop it, Albie.
He's spitting on my neck, you know, he
Thing,
spits
the
on my
most
neck when he
important thing of
talks.
all is
And you know something else? You know, you're so egocentric that if I miss my therapy, you can only think of it in terms of how it affects you.
Velton shot is what it is.
Probably on their
It's
first
a
date, right?
worldview.
They probably met by answering an ad in the New York Review of Books. 30-ish academic wishes to meet woman who's interested in Mozart, James Joyce, and sodomy. What do you mean our sexual problem? I mean, I'm comparatively normal for a guy raised in Brooklyn.
Okay, I'm very sorry. My sexual problem. Okay, my sexual problem, huh?
I never read that. That was Henry James, right? Novel?
You know what
The
it is?
sequel to Turn of the Screw?
It's the
Bisexual?
influence of television. Now, Marshall McLuhan deals with it in terms of it being a high intensity, you understand, a hot medium.
What I
as
wouldn't
opposed
give for a
to,
large sock
as
with horse
opposed
manure
to
in
print,
it.
which is essentially
What do you
linear.
do when you get stuck on a movie line with a guy like this behind you?
Wait a minute, why can't I
It's
give
just
my
maddening.
opinion? It's a free country.
He can give you. You have to give it so loud. I mean, aren't you ashamed to pontificate like that? And the funny part of it is, Marshall McLuhan, you don't know anything about Marshall McLuhan's work.
Really? I happen to teach a class at Columbia called TV, Media, and Culture. So I think that my insights into Mr. McLuhan, have a great deal of validity.
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
Well, that's funny because I happen to have Mr. McLuhan right here. So yeah. Just let me come over here a second.
No,
Tell him.
I heard what you're saying. You know nothing of my work. You mean my whole fallacy is wrong. How you ever got to teach a course in anything is totally amazing.
Boy, if life were only like this.
I love that. Anyway, McLuhan is most famously known for saying that the medium is the message. And it's a very difficult concept, but in simple terms, what he means is, for instance, radio is not text with sound. It's something else. It's its own thing, and it works on your brain in a different way from reading in print does. By the same token, television is not radio with pictures. It's its own thing. So the internet is all of those things, but it's also something else. And what is that? Socrates and Plato figure into this because when the printed word was coming into existence, Socrates was very upset about this. He thought that this is a new technology that is going to destroy our ability to think. We don't want to have things written down because then our ability to remember vast amounts of text will disappear. And his pupil Plato, disagreed with this and said to his mentor that, no, this isn't right. The written word is going to be a great thing because we won't have to remember everything the way we do now. So you see these arguments about how technology is affecting our ability to think and process information go back several thousand years. There's nothing new about this. Now this brings me to Nicholas Carr, who wrote a wonderful book pre-Facebook called The Shallows. And his idea in The Shallows is that spending a lot of time online is making us more shallow in terms of thinking. He said that our brains actually had to evolve for long-form reading, but that once, and evolve is probably the wrong term because we haven't really evolved particularly since the cave people, but each of us as children had to learn how to deal with long-form text in order to do the kind of deep reading and thinking that characterizes reading a book or reading a newspaper in some depth. So the internet is rewiring us for a life of skimming and multitasking. And one of the things that Carr argues, he later wrote an essay for Neiman Reports in which he said, news organizations need to find ways to encourage readers to slow down and engage. Now, another really wonderful book that I read as part of my research was a book called Magic and Loss by Virginia Heffernan. And the idea behind the title is the internet is magical, and yet at the same time we're losing something. She makes this wonderful analogy in her book saying that the internet is actually our greatest creation since monotheism. And I thought that was a pretty interesting way of putting it. She says, now we're overwhelmed with information, right? That's one of the big problems that we deal with in this explosion that the internet has fostered. And she says, digital literacy involves chiefly the refusal to read. We spend huge amounts of time going through stuff and trying to decide, can I skip this, can I skip this, can I skip this? Oh, this looks like something I ought to read. I'm going to bookmark it. And then maybe you'll get back to it later, maybe you won't. So how can journalism bring order out of the online distraction that we have? Now, there is a belief that, and I'm seeing it again in some pieces that I've read in just the past few days, I feel like it's 2005 all over again, where the news business is being criticized for a failure to innovate. And I would argue that actually newspapers have been innovating since the early 80s. It's just that the innovation in terms of the business model for what we do really never led anywhere because in some ways it couldn't. And we'll get to that. But anyway, this is a news report from a San Francisco TV station, KRON, in 1983 that gives you some idea of the innovation that was taking place even then. Some of you may have seen this before. Probably some of you haven't. Speak to me. Okay, here we go again. Sorry about that.
Imagine, if you will, sitting down to your morning coffee, turning on your home computer to read the day's newspaper. Well, it's not as far-fetched as it may seem. In fact, both local San Francisco papers are investing a lot of money to try and get a service just like that started. Science editor Steve Newman reports on one person already using the brand-new system.
17 stories up in his fashionable North Beach apartment, Richard Halloran is calling a local number that will connect him with a computer in Columbus, Ohio. Meanwhile, across town, in this less-than-fashionable cubbyhole at the San Francisco Examiner, these editors are programming today's copy of the paper into that same Ohio computer. When the telephone connection between these two terminals is made, the newest form of electronic journalism lights up Mr. Halloran's television with just about everything the Examiner prints in its regular edition. That is, with the exception of pictures, ads, and the comics. 8 newspapers around the country are currently in the computer network, and within the next few weeks, 3 others will join in.
This is an experiment. We're trying to figure out what it's going to mean to us as editors and reporters and what it means to the home user. And we're not in it to make money. We're probably not going to lose a lot, but we aren't going to make much either.
Both the Examiner and Chronicle began service within the last 2 weeks and printed full-page ads about it. Of the estimated 2,000 to 3,000 home computer owners in the Bay Area, the Chronicle reports over 500 have responded by sending back coupons. Even though the electronic newspaper isn't as spiffy looking as the ads imply, people using the system are excited about its potential.
With this system, we have the option not only of seeing the newspaper on the screen, but also optionally we can copy it. So anything we're interested in, we could go back in again and copy it onto paper and save it, which I think is the future of the type of interrogation an individual will give to the newspapers.
This is only the first step in newspapers by computer. Engineers now predict the day will come when we get all our newspapers and magazines by home computer, but that's a few years off. So for the moment at least, this fellow isn't worried about being out of a job. Steve Newman, U Center 4.
Well, it takes over 2 hours to receive the entire text of the newspaper over the phone, and with an hourly use charge of $5, the new telepaper won't be much competition for the 20-cent street edition.
Not then, but obviously that changed very quickly. 1983. Now, in 1994, I remember attending a conference at the Columbia School of Journalism where one of the speakers was Roger Fidler. You remember Roger Fidler? He was the head of the Knight Ridder Design Information Laboratory, and he had this vision that was that in some ways was so futuristic that we haven't caught up with it yet, and yet he missed the most important thing. He believed that we would have digital tablets, better than an iPad, flexible, so cheap that newspapers would give them away so that they could get rid of their printing. And yet, he missed the internet entirely. He said, well, you'll plug them into the cable box on your TV at night and buy the content that you had previously paid for. And what he missed entirely was that we were about to plunge into this huge sea of information. Now, if newspapers were thinking about the future as far back as 1983, why did technology have such a deleterious effect on their business model? I have showed this slide before. Probably some of you have seen it, whether shown by me or somebody else. And what you see is that newspaper advertising went up steadily until the year 2000 and then fell off a cliff. And you can see this red line here. It shows that digital advertising at newspaper websites really never amounted to a hill of beans. Meanwhile, Google and Facebook really took off. So what happened? First of all, I think you've all heard this before. Craigslist came along and took pretty much all the classified ads. It was free for the most part. There's a few types of ads you have to pay for, but for the most part it was free. And I said I've read a couple of things in the last few days that feel like it's 2005 all over again. There is a one writer was blaming newspapers for being greedy about classifieds and thereby letting in Craigslist. Well, whether you're greedy or not greedy, you can't compete with free. People are going to go to free. It only makes sense. Just to give you an idea of what a lean operation Craigslist is, the last I checked, Craigslist had about 40 employees worldwide. To this day, even after a number of cutbacks, the Boston Globe newsroom employs 220 people. That's one part of one news organization. So you see, there's just no way to compete with Craigslist. The other part is that the display advertising, which is essentially everything else, that's rather attractive in a print newspaper, never made a good transition to digital. I would argue that no one has ever clicked on a banner ad except by mistake. And then finally, Google and Facebook have been around for a while, but in the last few years they've just really taken off, and they're now taking more than 90% of all news spending on digital advertising. So how can news organizations, and in particular newspapers, compete at a time when online technology is leaving us with distracted readers trying to cope with huge amounts of information? Meanwhile, the business model just was not working. At least the business model for free content and advertiser-supported isn't working. This gives you some idea of how bad it really is. Nico Melli is the head of the Shorenstein Center at the Harvard Kennedy School. And he was explaining once that for a time he was deputy publisher of the LA Times. And he said a full-page ad would cost $50,000. It's a lot of money. And that money was used to support shareholders, of course, but also to pay for some of the journalism. The same ad, or an ad with the same reach on latimes.com, would be $7,000. And if it was a programmatic ad on latimes.com fed in by Google, which is an awful lot of the advertising that you see on news websites, you're talking about maybe $20. So you've gone from $50,000 down to $20. And so that has obviously created some real problems. Now, so how can newspapers create value in this environment? Neil Postman, who was one of the great media thinkers of the 20th century, not quite in Marshall McLuhan's category. I think Postman probably wrote too clearly to have the same kind of aura of mystery that McLuhan had. But he liked to say that a newspaper is a theory of what constitutes an informed person. And I saw a talk he gave once. Actually, he and Arthur Sulzberger Jr., then the publisher of the New York Times, were both speaking. And one of the things that Postman liked to say was that he loves the front page of a paper because you can argue with it. You can completely disagree about the judgments that the editors made as to what's important and what isn't. And yet, it's great because it's somebody's considered judgment as to what the most important news of the day is. So how can journalism maintain that mission and also make money, which has been a real problem? Well, first of all, we are starting to see gradually the emergence of a business model. National papers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal actually got there much earlier, have had some success in charging for digital subscriptions. I just finished reading and reviewing Jill Abramson's new book, Merchants of Truth, and a lot of it is about the New York Times and the Washington Post. And, they're both doing okay. I know that the Washington Post has claimed to be profitable the last few years. This is under the ownership of Jeff Bezos, the head of Amazon. And this moving away from the idea that all content ought to be free has really helped some of the big national newspapers. The smaller regional ones are trying as well. The Boston Globe has had some success. I just got another email this morning saying we're jacking up your rate again. And I said, well, this is interesting. I guess we can afford it, and I hope they can get away with it. Because the Globe, at the end of last year, actually reported, to a lot of people's surprise, that they had attained profitability. It's hard to know what they mean by that. It's a privately held company, and they don't report numbers. But I think it's significant that they're at least saying that they're now profitable. So we've kind of moved into this post-advertising world where newspapers really can no longer depend on advertising because it really didn't work online, and to the extent that it did work, it's all gone to Google and Facebook anyway. Another thing that we've seen an awful lot of news organizations do is they've gone heavily into electronic newsletters. And I was actually at a program at the Neiman Foundation last night where they were talking about, a lot of it was talking about newsletters. And newsletters are part of what is often referred to as the customer engagement funnel. And this is standard thinking in business, but it hasn't always been used in thinking about journalism. And the idea is that at the top of the funnel is your drive-by traffic. So, for instance, the Washington Post and the New York Times both get about 80 to 100 million unique visitors a month to their websites. That's drive-by traffic. And the idea is to try to grab them as they're flying by the top of the funnel and start pulling them down. And one of the ways you do that is with electronic newsletters. It makes them feel a little bit more part of what you're doing. It also keeps them off of Facebook. And actually, Facebook has been declining as a source of traffic to news sites. Direct traffic to news sites is actually up over the last year or so, which is certainly a good thing. Once they've got those newsletters, you start clicking around, and all of a sudden it's, gee, I've used up my 6 free clicks a month. Or in the Boston Globe's case, 3 free clicks every 45 days, which doesn't strike me as enough to really attract paying customers, but that's what they're trying. Maybe I ought to subscribe. And so now at that point, they've become paying customers. The program I was at last night was about nonprofit media, and they do the same thing, except that the newsletters are supposed to give them a warm and fuzzy feeling so that they become givers and members and all of that. And then finally, there may be a way of bringing back advertising in a digital world. The problem is Google has destroyed the value of digital advertising because it's so ubiquitous. There's just so much of it that the value of it has gone down. And Google has these online auction systems that drives it down even more. But what if you could charge advertisers on the basis of how much time people were spending with your journalism? We're beginning to get to the point where we can measure that. Now, 10 years ago, it was very crude. You could tell that a particular computer had a story open for 15 minutes, and you'd say, oh, this is good. This is really good. They must really like it. And then an hour passes, and it's still open. Say, oh, they must have, left the house or something. They've got one of those 15 tabs open. Now, we can actually measure whether a particular computer is moving through a story at reading rate or not. If you're going at a speed that indicates that you're reading, that's something that you can tell advertisers about. It sounds a little creepy, and although I don't think they'd ever do this, I would suggest that you do your news reading fully dressed. But that would be a way of bringing some of the value back. Now, I'd like to close just by giving you some ideas as to how you can get away from this distracted reading that we all deal with and try to engage deeply with journalism or anything else you're reading. And I've got a few ideas. One of them is to try to consume news in a format that's the least distracting. And what I've shown here is the Kindle edition of the New York Times. Now, I tend not to look at the Kindle edition except when I have to fly somewhere. But whenever I do, I notice that I'm able to engage with it more because Twitter isn't there, email isn't there, Facebook isn't there. The distractions that drive us crazy are not there. Obviously, print is an option for those of you who like such things. I actually, at this point in my life, I'm not a big fan of print newspapers, but the Kindle is one way to do it. Practice mindfulness when reading. Be aware that, I've got this temptation to see if an email came in. Got this temptation to check this, do that. And try to let it go and focus on what you're doing. We can't really multitask. Multitasking in some ways means we don't do anything well. So try to aim for that. You know, just in the last few days, I've been thinking about these issues more and more. Just in the last few days, I turned off all the news notifications on my phone. You know what? I'm going to find out. Well, this just in. President Trump tweeted something outrageous. Well, you know what? He'll do it again in 15 minutes, and you can catch up with it later. And then finally, be smart about social. Follow quality accounts. I'm finding that I'm trying to spend more time these days with a separate Twitter list I set up called Media Thinkers. And instead of the 600 or so accounts that I'm technically following, these are about 70 accounts that have more to do with my work. And I'm trying to tweet less, although I'm really not very good at that. And really, that's pretty much all I've got. And I figured I would try to wrap that up quickly so that we could talk about other things. Yes?
I have a question. Usually when I'm online reading the news, I have my ad block on because I find that all of the ads on news websites are very distracting and prevent you from really engaging. But then New York Times always gives me that little pop-up notification, like, please turn off your ad blocker, we need the money.
Right.
What would you say to that issue of trying to engage with the news, but also trying to support them by letting their ads be run?
Boy, that is such a great question, and it's something that I've wrestled with as well. At times I've experimented with an ad blocker, but I've ended up removing it just because so many of the sites I want to look at make you turn it off anyway. My feeling is that if online ads offered the same good experience that they do in print, no one would have any reason to turn on an ad blocker. Instead, not only are the ads popping up in front of you, behind you, playing video, doing all these other things that drive you crazy, but they're also tracking you and invading your privacy. I guess I would say that if a news site is following really good practices in terms of its advertising, then I do think it would be pretty lousy to block their ads. They are just trying to make money from it, and there's nothing wrong with that. But so few of them follow good practices. It surprises me that the New York Times and the Washington Post which have a pretty robust subscription model, are also showing you a lot of fairly abusive ads. I actually think the Globe is better. They're not perfect, but I think they're better. I don't see much in the way of pop-ups when I go to globe.com. This brings up another point, which is native advertising, which is very controversial. At its worst, it is designed to make you think it's actually part of the news site that you're looking at. But I think that when it's really properly labeled, there's really nothing wrong with it. One of the things that news sites like about native advertising is, first of all, it exists on your own server, and so usually it can't be blocked. Then the other thing is it's really not part of this Google auction hell, and as a result, the news organization is able to charge a pretty good rate for it. They're helping companies create this content, and the companies will pay a premium for that. So that's actually another way of restoring some value to advertising. But certainly, any news organization that is using native advertising and they're not properly labeling it as sponsored content or whatever, they definitely deserve to be called out for that. Yeah, Patrick?
I don't know how much I mean, I think this is a revenue-based question, but like we heard a lot about the Trump bump in terms of subscriptions for news outlets that after he got elected, and I've read a lot where like they've really started to level off. But like, do you sense that we're living in kind of this bubble that as soon as he's no longer in office, that news outlets that did see all this influx of subscribers are now just going to leave once like they don't have to worry about the day-to-day craziness that's happening within the White House?
That's certainly the fear. I think that we're all very fearful that when President Trump leaves office, and I assume he will at some point, that the bump that news organizations have experienced will go away. I guess the hope is that it's been shown that millennials have actually been pretty good about paying for news over the last few years. It's become something that they've become accustomed to. And the hope is that as we have become more taken in by services such as Spotify and Netflix and all of that, that the idea that everything on the internet ought to be free is really starting to fade into the past. And so that the news habits that have been built up over the past couple of years will remain. I hope that's the case. I hope that what's happening is that habits are changing and the Trump presidency is kind of helping to accelerate that trend. But once that comes to an end, we're not going to go back to where we were before. I don't think that the New York Times at the moment is up to something like 4 million paid subscribers, 3 million of them digital only. And I don't think that they're going to lose 2 million of them overnight when President Trump leaves office. I think one of the biggest problems right now is that, the Boston Globe, despite all the cuts that it's suffered, has maintained its quality pretty well. And John Henry is working on various ways of trying to turn it into a profitable enterprise. But most local and regional newspapers today are in the hands not of people like John Henry, but of large corporate chains, some of them controlled by hedge funds. And they really have no interest in trying to figure out how to build up the business. They are cutting as fast as they can to try to squeeze out what few remaining profits are there, and then they're just going to walk away when they reach the end of that line. And it's really unfortunate because there's no question that there are huge economic challenges facing the news business, but these corporate chains are making it much, much worse. And actually, interfering with the ability of people to innovate our way out of this. One of the things I'm hoping is that the New York Times and the Washington Post aside, because those are big national operations, but I hope that if John Henry actually is able to be seen as succeeding, that a lot of people will say, you know, hey, wait a minute, why is our chain-owned daily down to 60 people? We can do better than this, and we'll start to see some public-spirited business people coming into newspapers, trying to build up the journalism and get people to pay for it. Yeah, Matt?
So Margaret Sullivan, who's a media critic at the Washington Post, had a really interesting column the other day in which a person who lived in a town where there was a digital-first newspaper, which is one of these hedge fund-controlled papers where they're just crap journalism, and the person was like, okay, I realize my news organization now stinks, but there are some good people there. Should I pay to continue to support those few remaining good people, or should I quit, or should I drop my membership in, you know, sort of as a sign that I won't put up with this crap anymore?
Right.
And it's just kind of I have no answer for that question, but it is a sort of a tough question, I think, for a lot of people who realize that they're getting really bad journalism and want some kind of good journalism.
It is a tough question. I think her answer was yes, wasn't it?
Weak yes.
It was a weak yes, and I would also give it a weak yes. We have a Gatehouse Weekly in our medium-sized city, and they had one reporter. She was doing a great job. I was happy to pay for her to cover our city. She left. We're just hoping they replace her. We're just hoping they replace her. But I'll tell you, if they try to do it without replacing her, I don't think I'll renew our subscription. Jonathan?
This is on the content side, which is kind of your rules for how to improve things in terms of being mindful and stuff like that. But do you think that on the content side, newsrooms are being innovative enough? Because some of the, I thought it was interesting, you know, Netflix, podcasting, binge watching, all suggest that people's brains are still prepared for some kind of long, immersive experience. And I wonder if newsrooms need to be more creative. You know, like whoever would have predicted with distraction and all that stuff that people would sit for 8 hours watching, you know,
right.
a series on Netflix, or they'd listen for an hour to a podcast. So it seems to me that's out there too.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how newsroom could respond to that.
Well, I'm not sure that it comes down to innovation so much as it does maintaining a commitment to long form. But there are different ways of doing long form, right? I recently spent quite a bit of time with an absolutely fantastic project that Patrick contributed to, the valedictorian project that the Boston Globe did. And, you know, at its heart, it's long-form journalism. It was a long 5-part text-based story. But they also had brief profiles of over 100 valedictorians from 10 to 12 years ago to see where they are today. And if you were on the digital I haven't even seen it in print. I don't know what it looks like in print, but if you were looking at it digitally, you click on any picture and up comes a profile. There were these short videos. I'll give you another example. The Globe did a huge project last fall on Aaron Hernandez, and I looked at it and I said, oh God, I'm up to here with Aaron Hernandez. I am not going to read this. And then I saw they did a podcast. I said, well, I'll give it a try. It's riveting. I listened to all 6 hours of it. It was just absolutely fantastic. So yeah, I mean, these are ways that you can maintain a commitment to long form, but at the same time find ways to reach new audiences with the way you're doing it as well.
I think a lot of times people talk about these giant organizations sweeping in, gutting the papers. It happens with papers that are really reputable, like the Denver Post.
Yep,
not
digital
just the small
first.
ones, exactly. But I know in at least 2 scenarios one of which the paper I used to work for in Texas, where they're still locally owned, and similar tactics are kind of being put in play, and maybe people aren't being laid off, but people are grossly underpaid. There's cut in benefits and stuff like that. You mentioned in the book John Henry selling the Worcester Telegraph and Gazette, and people really being upset in that region because of that he sold it to Gatehouse. How do we fix that mid-level problem that I guess the Providence Journal is another paper that comes to mind. You know, it services a large amount of people, but maybe it's a smaller region that's not getting as much attention and less resources.
Well, they're a Gatehouse paper too.
Right.
I think that local journalism is in a huge crisis at the moment. Oh, and by the way, you talk about people being underpaid. The Globe, which now claims to be profitable, is apparently engaged in some really nasty negotiations with the union right now, trying to take away some of their benefits, and it does not seem like the sort of thing that you would be as hardball about as management seems to be acting if you were actually profitable. But we'll have to see how that plays out. I think that the crisis of journalism at the local level is something that we're all struggling with at the moment. I told you that I just finished reviewing Jill Abramson's book, and at the end she talks about, you know, these 4 big news organizations that she's written about have done okay, although they certainly still have their challenges. One of the ones she wrote about was BuzzFeed, which is having big challenges at the moment. But at the local level, it's really difficult. And I think that what we need to do is kind of take a look at what's working, and hopefully that will be emulated by other news organizations. I think this has to be a big role for nonprofit organizations. There's a lot of very good nonprofit news out there, and I think we need to encourage that. There are some interesting test cases out there. One of them is the Berkshire Eagle in Pittsfield.
I used to work for the Record, the weekly out there.
Oh, okay. Well, the Berkshire Eagle was for decades one of the most respected small dailies in the country. They were gutted by Digital First, but then a group of local business interests bought the paper from Digital First, and they've been spending the last couple of years trying to build it up. How are they doing? Are they making money? Are they showing that it's possible to make money with a paper like this if you're not, you know, greedy and devoted to squeezing out every last dime? I think that if they're succeeding at the Berkshire Eagle, and I'm not sure how well they're doing, I do know they built it up, well, that can be something that could be emulated in communities across the country.
I guess along with that, like each individual readership matters so much. For example, where I was in Texas, military town, transient, people weren't super interested in the local politics, the local government, because I weren't going to be there for more than 5 years. So that was troubling. And in the Berkshires, you get a lot of longtime people who never, ever, ever leave. I feel like they're more invested in their community, and maybe that's why the paper, that contributes at least to the idea that the paper will succeed and people will want to pay well for it.
That's a great insight. In my previous book, The Wired City, I interviewed a journalist in New Haven named Mark Oppenheimer, who he has been a religion columnist for the New York Times. He's done a lot of different things. And he was saying something that's very similar to what you're saying, and that is, he noticed that when he would bartend at Yale reunions to make some money, and he talked to the older people who were coming through there, it was very typical that, you know, people came from all over the country and then went back to their communities. You know, what Yale being the elite institution that it is, you might have some guy coming from Akron, Ohio, and then going back to his father's bank afterwards. And there's some downsides to that sort of non-mobility. But at the same time, he said, they were kind of the glue of their communities. And Mark noticed that with his peers, everybody went to one of 5 places after they graduated. It was Washington, New York, Silicon Valley, a couple other places. I forget what he said. And the point is, these are people who were not committed to their communities. And so you have had this shrinkage in interest in community journalism. I think that people often say what we need is more media literacy. And, you know, media literacy is always a good thing. I'm not going to say it's bad. But I think even more than media literacy, we need civic literacy. People need to understand why this stuff matters. You had this long period of time where newspapers brought in consultants. I mean, this was long before the current era, probably in the 70s and 80s. Newspapers would bring in consultants and they'd say, well, you know, people don't care about politics and people don't care about this, people don't care about that. Why don't you give them news they can use, financial advice, gardening columns? Well, you know, if you can't interest people in the essential accountability journalism that we were kind of made to do, then in the long run you're going to be playing a losing game, and you have to find a way to get people interested in what's important. And, you know, don't be boring about it. You don't have to be boring.
Do you see like online publications creating a memes page in the way that the comics were big? Stuff that the younger generation has latched onto, and there are people, personalities, especially on Instagram and things like that, who have become millionaires through having this witty sense of humor. Do you see that catching on at all, or maybe some sort of spin-off of that?
I'm not sure what you mean.
So I have a former roommate who, reasonably intelligent guy, but not an avid consumer of news, and he said that the only reason he finds out anything is through his Instagram feed. And he said one day, he has this theory that one day memes are just going to replace all news outlets, but it is a driving source of a lot of traffic, and I don't know, maybe things that are big in the internet outside of media, not a podcast, not a video put together.
I see.
Something like that might draw audiences in, and then they stay for the local government.
Well, the problem with memes is when they forget to translate it from the Russian first. You know, I don't know. You know, I've looked at I've studied a lot of online-only local news sources. The New Haven Independent, Voice of San Diego, Min Post, Texas Tribune. They're all pretty serious. Most of them are nonprofit. You can do an awful lot with, if you can get rid of the printing costs, and you can get rid of the reliance on advertising, you can actually do quite a bit with nonprofit funding, and it doesn't have to be boring. I urge anybody to take a look at the New Haven Independent. It was the principal thing that I looked at in the Wired City, and you know, you wonder if something like that's going to last. It's gotten bigger and better since I was doing my reporting on them. They've added a community radio station to what they do. I mean, it's remarkable. It's all nonprofit, but like I said, it's not boring, and people really seem to get into it, and they don't do memes.
Do we have any more questions? I guess one last thing. When you were at the Phoenix, it was a 3-newspaper town here in Boston. The Herald is having problem left and right, a lot of them to do with what we've talked about. What was it like living in a three-paper town, working in it, and do you have any fears if it goes down to a 1-paper town?
How was it a 3-paper town?
Well, with the Phoenix.
Well, the Phoenix was a weekly.
I feel like people, not that I lived through it at all, but I feel like, especially in sports media, people refer to it as like the third.
Oh, that's
outlet.
interesting. That's interesting.
Bill Simmons often refers to it.
Well, that's because he worked at the Phoenix at one time. Boston was a 2-daily town, and it still is a 2-daily town. No one wants to see the Herald go down, but I think that it's been a very, very long time since anybody would have defined the Boston media market by the Globe-Herald dynamic. I think that the Globe is still the 400-pound gorilla, even if it's not the 800-pound gorilla. But there are many other media organizations sort of revolving around the globe and trying to do things that the globe doesn't get to. I honestly don't think that I'm not even sure that I would put the Herald in the top 5 most important news organizations in Boston at this point. I think that the 2 public broadcasters, WBUR and the one that I work for part-time and that Jonathan's wife works for, WGBH, are incredibly vital alternatives to the Globe. Commonwealth Magazine. Now, I've just named 3 nonprofits, so that kind of shows you the energy that is in nonprofit journalism at the moment. Some of the neighborhood papers, the Dorchester Reporter, hugely important. So no one wants to see the Herald go away, but at this point, I don't think it would be any more disastrous than any one of these other news sources going away, and I hope they don't. This talk I went to last night, it was interesting. There was a former public radio consultant who was talking, and one of the things he said that is sticking with me is that increasingly, and of course Boston is unusual to have a second daily paper, but he said in many markets, the number 2 paper is the big public radio station. That's the alternative now. So I do wonder what's going to happen to the Herald. They're owned by Digital First. I have a source who's told me that